You cleaned your apartment last weekend. Not the regular kind of cleaning where you shove things into drawers and call it done. The real kind. You scrubbed the bathroom tile. You organized the shelf under the sink. You threw out that pile of clothes you'd been stepping over for 3 months. And when you were done, you stood in your living room and looked around at this space that was finally, genuinely clean. And you felt nothing, or worse than nothing. You felt a low hum of anxiety that you couldn't explain, sitting right behind your sternum, like your body was waiting for something terrible to happen. You've probably never told anyone about that feeling. Because how do you explain that a clean apartment makes you nervous, that peace feels like a setup, that the quieter your life gets, the louder something inside you screams, that this is wrong? Here's what I want you to sit with for a second. You did the work. You went to therapy. You read the books. You set the boundaries. You left the relationship or the job or the city or whatever it was that had been slowly grinding you down for years. You did everything you were supposed to do. And now you're standing on the other side of it, in this life that should feel better. And the truth you haven't said out loud is that you don't know who you are anymore. Not in the cute, philosophical, finding myself kind of way people post about on social media. In the terrifying, ground has disappeared beneath your feet kind of way. The kind where you wake up in the morning and the first thought isn't, what do I want today? But what am I supposed to do now that I'm not surviving anymore? That disorientation you're feeling, it's not a sign that you did something wrong. It's not a sign that therapy failed, or that you're broken in some unfixable way, or that you were better off before. It's actually the most predictable, well-documented stage of healing that almost nobody warns you about. Because here's what every therapist should tell you on day one, but almost none of them do. Healing doesn't just remove the pain. It removes the person the pain built. And if you spent 20, 30, 40 years becoming someone whose entire identity was organized around managing damage, then the absence of that damage isn't freedom. It's an identity crisis. That's what this is about. Not healing from trauma. You can find 1,000 videos about that. This is about what happens after. The part nobody talks about. The part where you get better and it feels like you're dying. Where the people you love start feeling like strangers. Where the life you built starts feeling like someone else's house that you accidentally walked into. The psychological term for it is identity dissolution. But that phrase doesn't capture what it actually feels like from the inside. From the inside, it feels like grief, like you're mourning someone who didn't die, because that someone is you. The version of you that knew exactly who they were, even if who they were was miserable. At least that person had a job to do. At least that person had a role. At least that person could wake up in the morning and know what the day required. And now, you're in this strange middle place where the old life doesn't fit, but the new one hasn't arrived yet. You're too healed to go back and too lost to move forward. And the cruelest part, the part that makes you wonder if you should have left things alone, is that the thing you're grieving is the very thing that was hurting you. You're mourning your cage, and you don't know how to tell anyone that because it sounds insane. It's not insane. It's neuroscience. It's psychology. It's attachment theory and nervous system regulation and identity formation. and about 60 years of clinical research that all points to the same conclusion. The person you built to survive was never actually you, but you wore them for so long that taking them off feels like removing your own skin. Let me show you why. You didn't build your identity on purpose. Nobody sat you down at 5 years old and said, "Here's who you're going to be." It happened the way most important things happen in childhood, which is to say, it happened without anyone noticing. A psychologist named Carl Rogers spent decades studying how people form their sense of self, and what he found was something that sounds simple but has devastating implications when you actually think about it. He found that children don't just develop naturally into whoever they are. They develop into whoever they need to be in order to keep receiving love. Rogers called this conditions of worth. And what it means is this: when you were very young, you learned, mostly through trial and error, which parts of you got warmth, approval, and attention, and which parts of you got silence, withdrawal, or punishment. And because you were a child, and because children cannot survive without their caregivers, you made a calculation that you didn't even know you were making. You amplified the parts that worked, and you buried the parts that didn't. Maybe you learned that being quiet kept the peace, so you became the quiet one. Maybe you learned that being funny diffused tension, so you became the funny one. Maybe you learned that being helpful made you indispensable, made you harder to leave, so you became the one who fixes things, the one who carries, the one everyone leans on. And here's where it gets complicated. These weren't random personality traits. They were survival strategies, brilliant ones. You read the room better than any adult in that house, and you figured out exactly what was required to stay safe. The psychologist Pete Walker, who specializes in complex trauma, calls this the Fawn response. He describes children who develop an almost psychic ability to read their parents' moods, to sense what's needed before anyone asks, and to shapeshift accordingly. He compares it to a dog rolling over on its back, showing its belly, hoping for mercy instead of harm. That comparison might sting a little. Sit with that for a second, because what Walker is describing isn't weakness. It's intelligence under duress. The Fawn response is the most sophisticated survival strategy a child can develop. It requires you to constantly monitor other people's emotional states, suppress your own needs in real time, and perform whatever version of yourself will keep the environment stable. That takes an enormous amount of cognitive and emotional processing. And when you've been doing it since you were 4 or 5 years old, it doesn't feel like a strategy anymore. It feels like a personality. It feels like you. That's the trap. The adaptation becomes the identity. The mask grows into the face. A British psychoanalyst named Donald Winnicott had a term for this that's so precise, it almost hurts. He called it the false self. Not false in the sense of fake or dishonest. False in the sense of constructed, built for a purpose. The false self, according to Winnicott, is a protective shell that a child creates when the environment isn't safe enough for their real self to exist. The real self, the one with actual needs and desires, and anger and joy, and all the messy, inconvenient parts of being human, gets locked away, hidden, preserved in some internal vault where it can't get damaged. And the false self goes out into the world and handles things. And it does a spectacular job. That's the thing nobody tells you. The false self is competent, functional, often wildly successful. The false self gets degrees, builds careers, maintains relationships, earns respect. From the outside, the false self looks like someone who has it together. From the inside, the false self feels like an elaborate performance that you can never stop giving. Because if you stop, if you let the mask slip even for a second, something catastrophic will happen. You might not be able to name what that catastrophe would be, but your body knows. Your body has known since you were small. This is where it gets physiological, and this is where most people's understanding of their own patterns completely breaks down. A neuroscientist named Stephen Porges developed something called Polyvagal theory, and what it describes is essentially this. Your nervous system has three modes. There's the ventral vagal state, which is where you feel safe, connected, and able to engage with the world. There's the sympathetic state, which is fight or flight. And there's the dorsal vagal state, which is shut down, collapse, numbness. Think of it as three gears, and your nervous system shifts between them based on what it perceives as safe or dangerous. But here's the part that changes everything. Porges introduced a concept called neuroception, which means your nervous system is constantly scanning for safety and danger below the level of your conscious awareness. You don't decide whether something is safe. Your body decides for you. Before you've had a single conscious thought about it, your nervous system has already made the call. And here's why this matters for the person standing in their clean apartment feeling anxious. Your nervous system was calibrated in childhood. Whatever environment you grew up in, that became your nervous system's definition of normal. Not safe, not healthy, normal, familiar. So if you grew up in chaos, your nervous system learned to treat chaos as baseline. The adrenaline, the scanning, the constant low-grade readiness for something to go wrong. That became your resting state. Your body adapted to it, built infrastructure around it. And over time, that heightened state stopped feeling like danger and started feeling like home. Dan Siegel, a psychiatrist at UCLA, talks about something called the window of tolerance. It's the zone of arousal where you can function, think clearly, handle stress, and engage with the world. For people who grew up in stable, predictable environments, that window is wide. For people who grew up in chaos or neglect or abuse, that window is narrow, and it's not centered where you'd think. For trauma survivors, the window is often calibrated around activation, not calm, which means calm itself can push you outside your window. Let me say that again because it's the thing that unlocks this entire conversation. Calm can push you outside your window of tolerance. That's why the clean apartment feels wrong. That's why a Sunday with nothing to do makes you crawl out of your skin. That's why the relationship that's actually healthy feels boring or suspicious or like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Your nervous system is telling you that this unfamiliar piece is dangerous. Not because it is, but because your nervous system has never learned what safety actually feels like. Deb Dana, a clinician who's built an entire therapeutic framework around Porges' work, describes it this way. She says the nervous system treats anything unfamiliar as potentially threatening. When your entire developmental period was spent in states of activation or shutdown, ventral vagal safety, real safety, the kind where you can actually relax, is the most unfamiliar state of all. So your body rejects it. Not because you don't want it, because your body literally doesn't recognize it. Sound familiar? Now layer the identity piece on top of this. You didn't just develop coping strategies in childhood. You developed a self, a whole person, organized around managing a world that wasn't safe. And that person, that adapted, vigilant, hypercompetent, emotionally literate, exquisitely tuned to other people person, that person has been running your life for decades. Think about what that means for a second. Every major decision you've made, every relationship you've entered, every career path you've chosen, every friendship you've maintained has been filtered through the preferences and priorities of a self that was built for survival, not for living. The survivor self chose partners who felt familiar, which meant partners who activated the same nervous system patterns your parents did. The survivor self chose work that let you be useful, indispensable, the one who holds everything together. The survivor self built a social circle where your role was clear. Helper, listener, fixer, the strong one who doesn't need anything. And none of that was wrong. All of it made sense. All of it served a purpose. But now you're in therapy, or you've done the reading, or something has shifted, and you're starting to see the scaffolding for what it is, and dismantling it, which is what healing requires, means dismantling the person you've been for as long as you can remember. This is the part where people panic. This is the part where they call their therapist and say, "I think I'm getting worse." This is the part where they almost quit. A researcher named Gregory Jurkovich spent years studying a specific form of this pattern called parentification. It's when a child takes on the role of caretaker in the family, either physically, by cooking, cleaning, managing siblings, or emotionally, by regulating a parent's moods, being their confidant, mediating conflicts that no child should be anywhere near. And what Jurkovich found was that the emotional form of parentification is far more damaging than the physical form, because it doesn't just give you tasks, it gives you an identity. When you're the child who holds the family together, person who holds things together becomes who you are. It's not what you do, it's what you are. And the devastating finding in Jurkovich's work, the one that I wish more people understood, is that parentified children don't just struggle to stop caretaking. They struggle to exist without it. Because without the role, there's a void. And the void is more terrifying than the exhaustion of carrying everyone ever was. That void is what you're feeling right now. If this resonates with you, that void is the thing sitting behind the anxiety in your clean apartment. It's the silence where your purpose used to be. And for some of you, the version of this that will hit hardest isn't the caretaking, it's the achieving. Because there's another way this pattern shows up that looks nothing like people pleasing from the outside, but runs on the exact same engine underneath. It looks like ambition. It looks like drive. It looks like someone who just works harder than everyone else, who always has another goal, another project, another milestone to chase. And from the outside, it looks like success. From the inside, it feels like a treadmill that you can't step off, because the moment you stop running, the thing you're running from will catch you. Jennifer Crocker, a psychologist who studies self-worth, identified what she calls contingent self-esteem. It's when your sense of value as a person is staked entirely on a specific domain: academic performance, career success, being the best at something, being productive. And her research found that people with externally contingent self-worth don't just feel bad when they fail. They feel like they don't exist because the achievement wasn't something they did. It was something they were. Remove it and there's nothing left. You might recognize this as the version of the pattern that gets rewarded. Nobody stages an intervention for the person who works 80 hours a week. Nobody worries about the person with 3 degrees and a spotless house and a packed calendar. That person looks like they're thriving. But what's actually happening is a survival strategy running at full speed. The achieving is the mask. The constant productivity is the wall between them and the void. And when healing starts to slow them down, when the burnout hits, or the therapy starts working, or they simply can't maintain the pace anymore, the same identity crisis shows up. Without the running, who am I? Without the doing, what's left? The answer is the same as it is for the caretaker. What's left is a self that was never allowed to exist without earning its place. A self that learned before it had words for it, that being wasn't enough. You had to produce something to justify taking up space. But it goes deeper than that, because the identity you built didn't just shape your behavior, it shaped your biology. Bessel van der Kolk, probably the most cited trauma researcher alive, wrote something that stopped me cold the first time I read it. He said that for people with chronic trauma, the traumatic past doesn't just haunt them. It becomes their sole source of meaning. Let me unpack that, because it sounds dramatic until you realize how precisely it describes the experience. When your entire developmental period was spent navigating danger, managing chaos, reading the room, anticipating needs, avoiding landmines, that navigation becomes the framework through which you understand yourself and the world. It becomes your story, your origin myth, the child who survived, the one who made it out, the one who's strong because they had to be. And there is nothing wrong with honoring that story. That story is real, and the strength it took was real. But here's the problem. When the trauma becomes the central organizing principle of your identity, when it becomes the reference point through which you interpret everything, when it becomes the story you tell yourself about who you are, then removing the trauma doesn't just remove pain. It removes the plot line. It removes the protagonist. It removes the reason the story made sense. 2 researchers named Dorte Bernsen and David Rubin developed something called the centrality of event scale, which measures how much a traumatic event has become part of a person's identity. And what they found was that the more central the trauma is to someone's sense of self, the stronger the correlation with PTSD symptoms. Not because the trauma was worse, but because the person had organized their entire identity around it. This is why some people can process trauma relatively quickly, and others seem stuck for years. It's not always about the severity of what happened. Sometimes it's about how deeply the event has been woven into the fabric of who they believe themselves to be. Pull that thread, and the whole tapestry starts to unravel. And the unraveling doesn't just happen internally, it happens in every relationship you have. Let me show you what this looks like in real life, because the theory only matters if you can see yourself in it. You've been healing, you've been growing, and the people around you, the ones who knew you before, are starting to feel different. Not because they changed, because you did. Maybe it's the friend who always came to you, with their problems. And you always listened, always helped, always dropped everything. And now you're starting to notice that the friendship only works in one direction, that they never ask how you are, that the entire relationship is built on your willingness to carry their emotional weight. And for the first time, you don't want to, not because you don't care, but because you're starting to realize that your caring was never really about them. It was about the role. It was about being needed. And now that you don't need to be needed in the same way, the friendship feels hollow. Or maybe it's the romantic partner, the one you chose because they felt like home. And now you're starting to understand what home actually meant. It meant familiar. It meant the same nervous system activation patterns you grew up with. The push and pull, the intensity, the making up after the fight, the chaos that your body interpreted as passion because it didn't know what actual intimacy felt like without the adrenaline. A psychiatrist named Murray Bowen, one of the founders of family systems theory, identified something he called differentiation of self. It's essentially the ability to maintain your own sense of identity while remaining emotionally connected to the people around you. People with low differentiation of self are fused with the people in their lives. They absorb other people's emotions. They lose themselves in relationships. They can't tell where they end and someone else begins. Healing increases your differentiation. That's literally what it does. You start to develop a clearer sense of where you end and other people begin. You start to recognize your own emotions as separate from the emotions of the room. You start to make choices based on your actual preferences instead of on what will keep everyone around you comfortable. And here's the thing that Bowen's research makes painfully clear. When one person in a system starts to differentiate, the system fights back. He documented this pattern across hundreds of families. When one member starts to change, starts to set boundaries, starts to occupy a different role, the rest of the system mobilizes to restore the old equilibrium. They do this unconsciously, automatically, and sometimes with startling aggression. Bowen called it the change-back reaction, and it sounds exactly like what it is. The system wants you to go back to who you were, because your old role was load-bearing. It was holding something in place, and when you remove it, the whole structure shakes. This is why setting boundaries feels so violent. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the system genuinely experiences your health as a threat to its stability. Your mother isn't trying to guilt trip you when she says, "You've changed." She's telling the truth. You have changed. And the family she built, the one where you occupied a very specific, very necessary position, the family doesn't work the same way without you in your old spot. Harriet Lerner, a psychologist who's written extensively about relational dynamics, describes what she calls the over-functioning, under-functioning pattern. In every system, someone does more and someone does less. And these roles are complementary. They need each other. The over-functioner needs to be needed, and the under-functioner needs to be carried. And when the over-functioner stops, when they put down the weight they've been carrying, the under-functioner is forced to either step up or escalate their demands for the old arrangement to continue. You might recognize this. You stopped being available at all hours, and suddenly you're selfish. You started saying what you actually think, and suddenly you're difficult. You asked for something you needed and suddenly you're too much. Those reactions aren't about you. They're about the system. But they feel personal. They feel like proof that the old you was better, more lovable, more worthy of connection. And that feeling, that specific cocktail of guilt and loneliness, and the terrifying suspicion that maybe being healthy means being alone. That feeling is the thing that sends people running back to their old patterns faster than almost anything else. And nobody talks about the grief of it. Not really. Pauline Boss, a therapist and researcher at the University of Minnesota, coined the term ambiguous loss to describe grief without closure. She originally developed it for situations like having a family member go missing or watching someone you love disappear into dementia. Situations where the person is gone but not gone, where there's no funeral, no clear ending, no socially recognized moment of loss. But ambiguous loss applies here too, and I think it's one of the most under-recognized aspects of deep psychological healing. When you outgrow a relationship, when the person you were in that relationship effectively dies, but you're both still alive and maybe still talking, there's no ritual for that. There's no ceremony. There's no casserole from the neighbors. You're just supposed to keep going, carrying this unnamed grief, this sense that something has ended that you can't quite point to. You might still see these people. You might still love them. But the version of you that fits seamlessly into their world is gone. And neither of you knows how to talk about that. You might catch yourself performing the old role out of habit, laughing at the joke that isn't funny, because that's what you've always done. Agreeing to plans you don't want, because saying no still feels like pulling a pin from a grenade. And then you leave, and you sit in your car, and there's this wave of something that feels like homesickness, except the home you're missing is a version of yourself. The hardest part isn't the people who react badly. The hardest part is the people who don't notice, the ones you've been performing for your entire life, and they've never seen the performance. They think the mask is your face, and when you start to lower it, they don't see a person emerging. They see their friend disappearing, and they grieve the version of you that was convenient for them. And they call that grief love, and you can't explain why that makes you want to scream. This is the grief that has no language, the grief of becoming someone your own history doesn't recognize, the grief of sitting across from someone you've known for 15 years and feeling like a stranger in your own friendship. Not because they're bad people, but because the relationship was built on a version of you that no longer exists, and you're the only one who knows it. And while you're navigating all of this externally, there's something even more disorienting happening inside. Your body is confused. Peter Levine, who developed somatic experiencing, spent decades studying how trauma lives in the body. Not in the mind, not in memories, but in the physical tissues and nervous system responses that never completed their natural cycle. Levine observed that animals in the wild, after a life-threatening event, will literally shake, tremble, and discharge the survival energy from their bodies. Their nervous systems complete the response, and they go back to normal. Humans don't do this. We suppress the shaking. We override the trembling. We hold it together. And because we never complete the discharge, the nervous system stays in a state of readiness. The threat never officially ended. What this means for healing is profound. Your body isn't just carrying memories. It's carrying incomplete survival responses, uncompleted movements, the flinch that never finished, the scream that stayed in your throat, the running that never happened. And when you start to heal, when the external threats are actually gone, your body doesn't just magically relax. It has to learn, slowly and sometimes painfully, that the emergency is over. And it doesn't believe you when you tell it. It has to experience the ending in its own time, through its own processes. Pat Ogden, who developed sensorimotor psychotherapy, calls these procedural tendencies, physical patterns that got encoded during trauma and keep repeating long after the situation has changed. The way you hold your shoulders, the way your jaw tightens in certain conversations, the way you cross your arms when someone gets too close, the way your breath gets shallow the moment things get quiet. These aren't personality traits. They're stored survival responses, still running their program, still protecting you from a threat that ended years ago. So when you're standing in that clean apartment, feeling wrong, it's not just your identity that's disoriented. Your body is disoriented. Your muscles are confused. Your nervous system is scanning for a threat that isn't there. And the absence of threat is, paradoxically, the most threatening thing it's encountered, because your body has never learned what after looks like. And then there's the self-sabotage, the part that makes you feel genuinely crazy. Gay Hendricks, a psychologist who spent years studying what he calls the upper limit problem, describes it as an internal thermostat for happiness. Everyone has a set point, a maximum amount of positive experience they'll allow themselves before something inside them says, "That's enough." And when you exceed that set point, you unconsciously create problems to bring yourself back down to familiar territory. You get the promotion and immediately start a fight with your partner. You have 3 amazing weeks and then blow up your routine. You feel genuinely peaceful for the first time in months and then scroll through your ex's social media at 2 in the morning, or drink too much, or start an argument about nothing, or simply find a way to feel bad again. Hendricks identified 4 hidden barriers that drive this pattern. The belief that you're fundamentally flawed and don't deserve the good thing. The fear that success means disloyalty to people who are still suffering. The worry that your happiness is a burden to others. And the terror that shining fully will make you a target. Sound familiar? Because if you grew up in a home where your well-being wasn't prioritized, where your needs were treated as inconvenient, where your happiness triggered jealousy or rage or withdrawal in the people responsible for keeping you alive, then every single one of those barriers is running in your operating system right now. The upper limit problem isn't a character flaw. It's a survival adaptation. Your internal thermostat was calibrated in an environment where too much happiness was genuinely dangerous, where being too visible, too loud, too successful, too okay meant attracting attention that could hurt you. So you learned to keep yourself small. You learned to stay just uncomfortable enough that nobody felt threatened by your existence. And now you're trying to build a life that exceeds your thermostat's setting, and your whole system is pulling emergency brakes you didn't even know existed. But there's another layer to this, and it might be the most uncomfortable one. Some part of you doesn't want to let the pain go, not because you enjoy suffering, but because without it, you don't know who you are. Viktor Frankl, the the psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps and wrote about finding meaning in the most horrific circumstances imaginable, identified something that applies directly to this experience, even though the scale is obviously different. Frankl observed that people can endure almost any amount of suffering as long as they can attach meaning to it. Suffering with purpose is survivable. What destroys people, Frankl said, is suffering without meaning. But here's the inversion that nobody talks about. If you've attached your meaning to your suffering, if the story of who you are is built on the foundation of what you survived, then removing the suffering doesn't just remove pain, it removes meaning. And the void that opens up when meaning disappears is what Frankl called an existential vacuum, a state of purposelessness and disorientation that can feel worse than the original suffering. This is why people stay in situations that are clearly hurting them. This is why people return to relationships they know are toxic. This is why people rebuild the same dysfunctional patterns in new cities, new jobs, new friendships. Not because they haven't learned, but because the dysfunction provides structure. It provides a narrative. It provides a role to play and a purpose to serve. And structure, even painful structure, feels better than free fall. Dan McAdams, a psychologist at Northwestern University, has spent his career studying what he calls narrative identity. The idea that we don't just have experiences, we organize those experiences into stories. And those stories, the ones we tell ourselves about who we are, where we came from and where we're going, those stories become the architecture of our identity. Here's why that matters for healing. When you start to change, when you start to let go of the pain and the patterns, you're not just changing your behavior. You're disrupting your story, the narrative that made sense of your life, the one where you were the survivor, the strong one, the one who got through it. That narrative is suddenly incomplete. The protagonist is dissolving. The plotline doesn't track anymore, and there's no replacement story ready to take its place. McAdams found something fascinating in his research. He found that in successful therapeutic outcomes, people's stories change before their symptoms did. They didn't get better and then rewrite their narrative. They rewrote their narrative and then got better. Which means the story isn't just a reflection of your identity. The story is your identity. And changing it is not a side effect of healing. It's the mechanism of healing. But rewriting a story that's been running for 20 or 30 or 40 years takes time. And in the gap between the old story ending and the new one beginning, you're storyless. You're a character without a plot. And that liminal space, that betweenness, is where most people lose their nerve. A psychologist named James Marsha built on Erik Erikson's work on identity development and identified 4 identity statuses. One of them is called identity moratorium, and it describes the state of actively exploring who you are without having made any commitments yet. Marsha's research found that of all the identity statuses, moratorium carries the highest anxiety, higher than foreclosure, where you've just adopted someone else's identity without questioning it, higher than diffusion, where you don't care. The people who are actively in the process of figuring out who they are experience the most psychological distress. You're in moratorium right now, and the anxiety you're feeling isn't a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that you're in the most difficult and most necessary phase of identity development. But try telling yourself that at 2 a.m, when you can't sleep. Because here's the cruelest part of all of this, the part that makes it feel genuinely impossible sometimes, the thing that's making you feel bad. The medicine tastes like the poison. Let me explain what I mean by that. When Winnicott described the false self, he said something that I think about constantly. He said the false self exists to conceal a barren emptiness behind an independent-seeming facade. The operative word there is barren, because when you finally dismantle the false self, when you take off the mask, what you find underneath isn't some gleaming, authentic self waiting to emerge like a butterfly from a cocoon. What you find, at first, is emptiness, blankness, a space where a self should be, but isn't yet. And that emptiness, that absence, triggers the same terror that the false self was originally built to prevent. In psychoanalytic terms, it's called annihilation anxiety, the primal, pre-verbal dread that you will literally cease to exist. The false self was constructed in childhood specifically to prevent this experience. It was the wall between you and the void. And now you're voluntarily taking down the wall, and the void is right there, exactly as terrifying as your body always warned you it would be. This is why healing feels like dying, because at a nervous system level, it is. The self that your body has identified as you for decades is dissolving. And your body doesn't know the difference between a self dissolving because you're growing and a self dissolving because you're being destroyed. It registers both the same way. With panic, with grief, with the overwhelming urge to rebuild the old structure as fast as possible, even if the old structure was killing you. Richard Schwartz, the psychologist who developed internal family systems therapy, offers maybe the most compassionate framework for understanding this experience. Schwartz proposes that we don't have a single self. We have parts, protective parts that formed in childhood to manage overwhelming experiences. And beneath all those parts, there's what Schwartz calls the self, capital S, the core of who you actually are, underneath all the adaptations and defenses and survival strategies. Schwartz describes 8 qualities of the self: curiosity, calm, clarity, compassion, confidence, courage, creativity, and connectedness. And his clinical observation, confirmed across thousands of sessions, is that these qualities don't need to be built or developed. They're already there. They've always been there. They just get buried under the weight of all those protective parts. But here's the part that's relevant to what you're going through. The protective parts don't know they're not you. They think they're you. They've been running the show for so long that they've forgotten they were ever supposed to be temporary. And when you start to heal, when you start to access the self underneath, the protective parts don't step aside gracefully. They panic, they escalate, they throw up every defense they have, because from their perspective, you're not healing, you're abandoning them. You're dismantling the very system that kept you alive. Schwartz describes the moment a client realizes their protectors aren't actually them as something like discovering that what they thought was their hair was really a wig all along. It's disorienting, it's destabilizing, but it's also the beginning of everything, because the self underneath the parts, it's not blank. It's not empty. It's the thing your body has been guarding since childhood. And the reason it feels like emptiness at first is that you've never had access to it before. You're meeting yourself, your actual self, for the first time. And just like any first meeting, it takes a while before you recognize who you're looking at. Now, I want to bring the body back in, because everything I've described so far might sound like it lives in the mind, like it's about thoughts and stories and beliefs. And it is about those things, but it's also about tissue and breath and muscle and bone. Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist at USC, developed something called the somatic marker hypothesis. What it means, in plain language, is that your body keeps a running record of your emotional experiences and uses that record to guide your decisions below the level of consciousness. Every time something good happened, your body made a note. Every time something bad happened, same thing. And now, when you encounter a new situation, your body checks its records and sends you a feeling, a gut sense, a pull toward or away from the thing in front of you. For people with trauma, those somatic markers are distorted. The body's record is full of entries that say closeness equals danger, and calm equals something is wrong, and being seen equals being targeted. So when you encounter actual safety, actual closeness, actual peace, your body's guidance system doesn't say yes. It says run. This is why you can't think your way out of this. This is why reading the right book or having the right insight doesn't automatically fix the pattern. Because the pattern isn't living in your thoughts. It's living in your body, in your gut, in the tightness in your chest when someone is too kind to you, in the way your shoulders come up around your ears when someone tells you they love you, in the way you hold your breath. Right now, while you're listening to this, because some part of you recognizes itself in these words, and that recognition itself feels like a threat. Van der Kolk put it simply. He said, "The body keeps the score." But what he meant was something far more specific. He meant that trauma reorganizes the brain and body's entire system for perceiving and managing experience. It's not that you remember the bad thing and feel sad. It's that your entire perceptual apparatus has been recalibrated. You literally see the world differently. You feel it differently. Your body processes information through a filter that was installed in childhood and has been running, unchallenged, ever since. And healing requires updating that filter, not with thoughts, not with affirmations, not with understanding, with experience. But that is where the hope lives. And I know the word hope might feel suspicious right now, because you've been in this disoriented, grief-stricken, identityless middle place, and the hope feels like a luxury you can't afford. So let me skip the inspirational language and tell you what the neuroscience actually says. Your brain is not fixed. That sentence sounds like something from a self-help poster, but it's actually one of the most well-established findings in modern neuroscience. The term is neuroplasticity, and what it means is that your brain physically reshapes itself in response to new experience throughout your entire life. Carla Schatz, a neuroscientist at Stanford, coined the phrase that captures the mechanism: neurons that fire together wire together. Every time you repeat a pattern, the neural pathway for that pattern gets stronger. Every time you engage in a new experience, a new pathway forms. And critically, pathways that stop being used get weaker over time. Neurons that fire apart wire apart. This matters because it means the neural architecture that supports your trauma-based identity is not permanent infrastructure. It's maintained by repetition. by the daily reinforcement of old patterns. And when those patterns stop being reinforced, when new experiences start laying down new pathways, the old architecture doesn't just stay there forever, gathering dust. It weakens, it gets pruned, it makes room. This takes time. Synaptic changes can happen in minutes to hours. Structural changes, the kind you can see on brain scans, take 2 to 3 months of consistent new experience. Deep rewiring, the kind that involves core identity patterns and complex trauma, takes anywhere from 6 months to 2 years or more. And that timeline isn't something you can rush, any more than you can rush a broken bone healing. The biology has its own pace. But here's what makes this process different from everything you've been told about healing. It's not about insight. It's not about understanding why you are the way you are. Understanding is necessary, but understanding alone changes almost nothing in the nervous system. A neuroscientist named Karim Nader, along with Joseph Ledoux at NYU, discovered something in the early 2000s that fundamentally changed how we think about traumatic memory. What they found was that every time a memory is recalled, it enters a briefly unstable state where it can be modified. There's a window, roughly 4 to 6 hours, during which the emotional charge of the memory is malleable. The facts stay the same. You don't forget what happened, but the intensity, the terror, the visceral punch of the memory can be reduced, rewritten, updated. Nader described it this way. He said, memories are not stored like files on a computer. They're reconsolidated every time they're accessed, which means every time you remember, you're not retrieving a fixed recording. You're rebuilding the memory from scratch. And in that rebuilding process, there's an opportunity to change what gets built. This is the neuroscience behind what a psychoanalyst named Franz Alexander, decades earlier, had called the corrective emotional experience. Alexander described it as being re-exposed to a situation similar to the original traumatic one, but under new, favorable conditions. You expect the old response, the rejection, the punishment, the abandonment, and instead, you receive something different: safety, acceptance, presence. And that difference, that gap between what your nervous system expects and what it actually receives, that gap is where healing happens. Not in the insight, not in the understanding, in the lived, felt, bodily experience of something going differently than your body was sure it would. This is why Schwartz's IFS work is effective. Not because understanding your parts is intellectually satisfying, although it is, but because the process of relating to your parts with curiosity and compassion instead of the fear and suppression they're used to is itself a corrective emotional experience. The parts that have been running on emergency protocols for decades encounter something they've never felt before. Attention without agenda, interest without judgment. And in that encounter, something shifts, not in the mind, in the nervous system. This is why Levine's somatic experiencing works. Not because you talk about what happened, but because you allow the body to complete the survival responses that got interrupted, the shaking that was suppressed, the running that didn't happen, the pushing away that was too dangerous to attempt. When those incomplete responses are finally allowed to complete, the nervous system gets the signal it's been waiting decades to receive. It's over. You made it. You can stop now. Levine has a specific approach to this that I think is critical to understand if you're in the middle of this identity dissolution. He calls it titration. It means processing difficult material in small, manageable doses, not flooding yourself with everything at once, not ripping off the Band-Aid and hoping for the best, but approaching the edge of what you can tolerate, staying there long enough for your nervous system to adjust, and then pulling back. A little bit, slowly, then a little more, then a little more. He also talks about pendulation, which is the natural rhythm of moving between activation and settling, between contact with the difficult material and return to safety, between the edge and the center. Healing, in Levine's model, isn't a straight line from broken to fixed. It's a rhythm, an oscillation, a wave that moves back and forth, each time covering a little more ground. This is why your healing doesn't feel linear. It's not supposed to. The day where you feel like yourself for the first time is supposed to be followed by a day where you feel completely lost again. That's pendulation. That's your nervous system doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It touches the new, then it retreats to the familiar, then it touches the new a little longer. Each cycle extends your capacity. And here's something that might shift your relationship with the entire process. Deb Dana, the polyvagal clinician I mentioned earlier, talks about something she calls glimmers. They're the opposite of triggers. Triggers are cues that push your nervous system into threat mode. Glimmers are cues that invite your nervous system into safety. A moment of genuine laughter. The way sunlight hits the floor in the morning. The feeling of warm water on your hands. The split second when you forget to be on guard and your shoulders drop an inch. These moments are small, almost invisible, and your trauma-calibrated brain is trained to dismiss them because it's been scanning for danger your entire life, and it doesn't have the habit of noticing safety. But Dana's work suggests that these glimmers are not just pleasant experiences. They're the building blocks of a new nervous system baseline. Each time you notice a glimmer, each time you let yourself dwell in it for even a few extra seconds, you're strengthening the ventral vagal pathway, the one that knows how to be safe, the one that got starved during your development, the one that's been waiting all this time for permission to come online. You are not building a new self from nothing. You are uncovering a self that has been waiting underneath the rubble of everything you had to become to survive. And that distinction matters because it means you're not starting from zero. It means the curiosity you sometimes feel, the creativity that surfaces unexpectedly, the moments of calm that sneak up on you before your anxiety shuts them down. Those aren't random. Those are the self, capital S, peeking through. Those are the parts of you that have been preserved, protected by the very defenses that are now dissolving. Here's what I need you to understand about the disorientation you're in. It has a name, it has a mechanism, it has a timeline, and it has an ending that isn't just going back to normal. But getting to that ending requires something specific. It requires you to tolerate the middle, the storyless, identityless, groundless middle, the part where the old you has died and the new you hasn't been born yet, the part where your nervous system is panicking because it doesn't recognize the landscape, the part where your relationships are shifting and your roles are collapsing, and everything you used to know about yourself feels like a language you've forgotten. Joseph Campbell, the mythologist who mapped the structure of stories, across every culture in human history, described a phase in every hero's journey that he called the descent, the belly of the whale, the abyss, the dark night of the soul. And his observation across thousands of myths and stories spanning centuries was that the descent is not the failure. It's the requirement. You cannot reach the treasure without entering the cave. And the cave you're most afraid to enter, Campbell said, turns out to be the source of what you're looking for. The cave you're in right now, this bewildering, grief-soaked, purposeless middle space, is not a sign that you've gone wrong. It's the passage. It's the part of the story that the old you couldn't have survived, because the old you wasn't equipped for it. The old you knew how to function in crisis. The old you knew how to carry weight, fix problems, rid rooms, stay invisible, stay useful. The old you was an absolute genius at surviving. But survival isn't the assignment anymore, and the old you doesn't know what to do in the absence of an emergency. That's not a flaw in your healing. That's the whole point of your healing. So let me tell you what's actually happening, physiologically, in the middle. Robin Carhart-Harris, a neuroscientist at UCSF, has done extensive research on something called the default mode network. It's a set of brain structures that, in simple terms, generate your sense of self, your ongoing internal monologue, your autobiographical narrative, the voice in your head that says, I am this kind of person who does these kinds of things. The default mode network is, neurologically speaking, the seat of your ego. What Carhart-Harris found, initially through studying psychedelic experiences, but later confirmed through meditation and therapeutic research, is that when the default mode network's activity decreases, when it loosens its grip, people describe the experience as ego dissolution. The boundaries of the self become less rigid. The old story stops playing on repeat. And in that space, new patterns can form. He calls his theoretical framework the rebus model, which stands for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, though the principle applies beyond psychedelics. The idea is that your brain operates on a set of deeply held predictions about the world. These predictions are formed by experience, particularly early experience, and they become the lens through which you perceive everything. They're efficient, they're automatic, but they can also be wrong. They can be outdated. They can be holdovers from a childhood environment that no longer exists. When those beliefs relax, when the default mode network loosens, the brain enters a state of increased entropy, more flexibility, more possibility, more chaos, yes, but also more potential for reorganization. This is what you're experiencing. Your default mode network, the neural system that has been maintaining your trauma-based identity for decades, is loosening its hold. The old predictions are softening, the old story is fading, and the chaos you feel, the identity confusion, the disorientation, the who am I panic is not breakdown. It is your brain in a state of increased plasticity. It's the neurological equivalent of wet clay before it's been reshaped. The question is not whether you can be reshaped. The question is what shape you'll take. And for the first time, you get to have a say in that. Rachel Yehuda, a researcher at Mount Sinai who studies the epigenetics of trauma, has documented something that sounds impossible, but changes everything once you understand it. She found that trauma doesn't just affect the person who experiences it. It leaves epigenetic marks, chemical tags on genes that alter how those genes are expressed, and these marks can be passed to the next generation. She documented this in the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, finding specific methylation patterns on a gene called FKBP5 that were different from control groups. But here's why this is hopeful, not terrifying. Those same epigenetic marks are mutable. They can change. They are not permanent inscriptions. They are pencil, not ink, which means the patterns you inherited, the ones you didn't choose, the ones that were written into your biology before you were born, even those can be rewritten. Not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. You are not in a biological prison. The walls that feel so solid are more like habits, neural habits, physiological habits, habits that feel like identity because they've been running since before you had words. But habits, by definition, can be changed. Here's what the actual process looks like. Not the inspirational version, the real one. You're going to have days where you feel like a completely different person, where the anxiety lifts and you catch a glimpse of something underneath it that feels calm and curious and actually alive. And then you're going to have days where none of that is accessible and the old patterns come roaring back and you're convinced you've lost all your progress. You haven't. Pendulation, remember? Touch the new, retreat to the familiar. Touch the new a little longer next time. This is the rhythm. It's not failure, it's the mechanism. You're going to lose relationships. Some of them, not all of them. The ones built entirely on your old role will fall away. Because without the role, there's nothing holding them together. And that will hurt in ways I can't minimize. You'll grieve people who are still alive. You'll miss versions of yourself that you outgrew. You'll lie awake wondering if you should just go back, just pick up the old mask, just be the person everyone needed you to be. That feeling will pass. Not all at once, but gradually, the grief will shift from "I lost something" to "I'm making room for something." You're going to feel empty, genuinely, uncomfortably empty, because the space where your coping mechanisms used to be is still adjusting to not being filled. That emptiness isn't the same as being hollow. It's the same emptiness you feel in a house after you've moved the old furniture out, but before the new furniture has arrived. The room isn't broken, it's between arrangements. You're going to sabotage things, probably more than once. Your upper limit thermostat is going to kick in right when things start going well. You'll pick the fight, miss the deadline, eat the thing, say the thing, avoid the thing. And when it happens, you're going to have a choice. You can interpret it as proof that you're broken and will never change, or you can recognize it for what it is. An old program running, a thermostat trying to bring you back to baseline. Not evidence of failure, evidence that you're exceeding the old limits, and the thermostat will recalibrate. Not the first time you exceeded, not the second time, but with enough repetitions of, "I can be here, I can tolerate this level of okayness, I can let this good thing exist without destroying it." The thermostat adjusts. You're going to need new experiences, not just new insights. Corrective, emotional experiences, moments where your body expects the old response and gets a different one. The friend who asks how you're doing and actually waits for the answer. The partner who sees you're ugly and stays. The therapist who sits with your silence without rushing to fill it. The coworker who respects your boundary and nothing bad happens. Each one of these moments, and they will feel small, almost insignificant when they happen. Each one is a data point that updates your body's prediction model. Each one says, see, it can go differently. It can actually be okay. And over time, months and sometimes years, those data points accumulate. The neural pathways for safety get stronger. The ventral vagal pathway, the one that knows how to rest and connect and be present, gets more established. The old pathways, the hypervigilance, the people-pleasing, the chronic scanning for danger, they don't disappear entirely. They're still there, but they're no longer the default. They become options rather than compulsions. Parts you can listen to rather than parts that run your life. Schwartz, the IFS developer, talks about this as a shift from parts-led to self-led. When the protective parts realize they don't have to run the show anymore, when they experience enough safety to believe that the self underneath can actually handle things, they start to relax, not all at once, in their own time, at their own pace. But they step back, and the self, the one with the curiosity and the calm and the creativity, the one that's been waiting underground since childhood, that self comes forward, not as a finished product, not as some perfected, enlightened version of you, but as a presence, a steady, quiet presence that can hold complexity without being destroyed by it, that can feel sad without being consumed by sadness, that can sit in a clean room and feel the anxiety and also feel something else underneath it, something that doesn't have a name yet but feels, tentatively, like it might be peace. I want to go back to that apartment for a second, the clean one, the one where you stood and felt wrong. Imagine standing in that same room 6 months from now, or a year. The room is still clean. The anxiety might still be there, faintly, like a familiar song playing in a distant room. But this time, you don't flinch. You notice it. You recognize it. You might even smile at it. The way you'd smile at a guard dog that's been protecting an empty house and doesn't realize the war ended. And underneath the anxiety, in the space that used to be void, there's something new, not dramatic, not a revelation or a breakthrough, just a quiet sense of being present in a room that belongs to you, in a body that belongs to you, in a life that doesn't require you to perform or protect or produce anything in order to justify its existence. Your nervous system doesn't believe that yet. It might not believe it for a while, but it can learn. The research says it can learn. The plasticity is there. The capacity is there. It's been there the whole time, buried under the rubble of everything you had to become. And maybe, right now, it's enough to know that the confusion you're in has a name, that the grief has a source, that the emptiness has a function, that the person who feels like they're disappearing is actually, for the first time, making room to appear. You spent your whole life becoming the person other people needed. You became so good at it that you forgot it was a performance. And now, the performance is ending. Not because you failed at it, because you outgrew it. What comes next is the part nobody could have scripted for you. Not your parents, not your therapist, not the coping mechanisms that ran your life for decades. What comes next is the part where you find out who you are when you're not in survival mode. And that's terrifying because you've never done it before, but you're already in it. That's the part you might be missing. This disorientation, this grief, this raw and unfinished feeling of being between selves. This is not the waiting room. This is it. This is the becoming. It's happening right now. in the confusion, in the silence where your purpose used to be, in the strange quiet of a life that doesn't need you to save it. The cave you're afraid to enter turns out to be the source of what you're looking for. You're already inside it. And the person standing in that clean apartment, the one who felt wrong, that person wasn't broken. They were just meeting themselves for the first time. And first meetings are always a little awkward.